Hey everyone, long time no see. I hope you're all well. As you can see, I still have not had a haircut. As a result, it must be kept hidden under hats 24/7. However, I have reached the mythical man bun stage, so hurrah! One of the reasons why we haven't done one of these videos in quite a while is because we've been concentrating most of our time on our live on Zoom speaker series titled Racialized People and Democracy. Now, if you're interested in this series, please do check out our website for a full schedule. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Brian Gettler, professor of history at the University of Toronto. He's here to discuss his latest book, Colonialism's Currency, Money, State, and First Nations in Canada, 1820 to 1950, published this past July with McGill Queen's University Press, a book that analyzes the historical experiences and interactions of three distinct First Nations with monetary forms and practices created by colonial powers. And now, without further ado, let's go. Hey Brian, how's it going?
All right, Max. It's a pandemic, so we're making do.
Yeah, thanks for coming and thanks for talking to us about your book today. So we're here today to discuss your new book, Colonialism's Currency, Money, State, and First Nations in Canada, 1820-1950, which was published just this past July with McGill Queen's University Press. So first of all, congratulations. I know it's a big deal to publish a book, so congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah.
And
I look forward to not having to think about it so much.
I know you're suffering from like PTSD, and every
Yeah.
time you hear, like the words currency and like.
Yeah.
So I briefly talked about your book in the introduction to this video, but can you tell us a little bit more about it, what it's about, the general themes and topics?
Yeah, sure. So what it does is it takes money itself as sort of the object of analysis. And I would say more than an object, it's really a practice of analysis. So it really wants to look at money more as a thing we do than as a thing that is. Um, so it follows the presence and explicit absence of money through settler indigenous relations, through debates, through actual sort of relations on the ground, I guess, and highlights, I guess, the sort of main things it highlights are um, the ways in which money plays a major role in discourses of assumed indigenous improvidence. So, the idea that indigenous peoples cannot handle money responsibly, and also how the kind of official claims to space that these make. I'd say, like, it leads to a few kind of different perspectives, maybe that are interesting contributions. I would humbly suggest, I guess, that first of all, the fur trade, um, it makes the argument that the fur trade has been monetized from more or less the very beginning,
Mhm.
or very shortly thereafter. Historians have long um, ignored, I would say, money in the fur trade, and especially earlier forms, what I call money in the book, like the Made Beaver, like the Hudson's Bay Company currency, coming up with sort of elaborate ways of describing what's going on, including things like modernized barter. This notion that barter was happening, but at different times, and people were recording it using this notation in ledgers. But of course, if you spend any time thinking about money, I mean, this is effectively what money is, right? It's just not cash. We're talking about a medium of exchange, a unit account, a store of value. This is the sort of orthodox economics definition that often gets hidden, I would say, both by economists and historians working on it. It also makes the claim that money is kind of key to fur trade monopolies' claims to space, and in colonial British North America. So it follows here kind of an argument that's been developed in other parts of the globe and other parts of the British Empire, especially with respect to like the East India Company, of seeing the Hudson's Bay Company as really a form of a claim to sovereignty, a political structure, as well as a commercial organization. It looks too at how indigenous peoples get cast as wards of the state. So this is a phenomenon that historians know quite a bit about in the 19th century, how indigenous peoples, Indians, get defined as minors under the law. And one of the arguments the book makes is that the discussion about money that's happening in policy circles leads to this figure of what I refer to as the improvident Indian, that then justifies state intervention in indigenous villages in ways that the state had never done previously. This is reinforced by the money itself. So this is kind of another contribution I think I'm making. If you actually look at the cash that's circulating in Canada, you see all sorts of representations of indigenous peoples. They tend not to be flattering. They tend to be most often of the sort of noble savage variety, the kind of passive observer of modernity. So often, the cover of the book is an image of an indigenous man sort of passively watching as a train drives livestock across the prairies from a city in the background. It's this very sort of, it's smacking you in the face what the message is. It's not subtle at all. And so the representations here are important. And also then as time moves on, as you get into the early 20th century, and indigenous peoples disappear from currency and are replaced by these kind of high imperial representations of governors and royalty. And then by the mid 20th century, when all of this has disappeared and we're now just kind of left with vast Canadian wilderness on currency. So like the erasure of both kind of these high imperial figures, but also indigenous peoples, quite obviously, from the money. And then I guess finally, money then through all of this is being one of the key ways that the state lays claim to territory, that it defines different populations. When it circulates money, as in treaty, for example, treaty payments are one of the strange examples that I go into, in the sense that the state is actively giving money to indigenous peoples. It's one of the rare occasions in the book. But this is part of, the Canadian national state expanding its borders and circulating this really visible symbol of its sovereignty. And I think we often forget that today when we think about money, because we're operating, most of us, especially in this pandemic world, in this kind of non-cash economy. So we're handling less and less cash than we did, only a few decades ago, or more recently, in fact. But in the past, these were major symbols of the nation state that all sorts of people received and were using. And through treaty, in fact, indigenous peoples were, in some sense, with their treaty payments, kind of flag bearers of the Dominion. As they they spent this money and they injected money into economies of still distant regions that are being integrated into the Canadian nation.
One of the elements that I think that people will appreciate the most about your book is really how you engage with French and English language scholarship. And though it's not as bad as it used to be, there is a historiographic divide between French and English language scholarship, and it's still present in Canada, and especially like in the case of your work, especially after the conquest of New France. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, about engaging with two different scholarships?
Yeah, I think I wish more people would join me. So hopefully they will. I think that this is it's obvious, right? And I think I think we can have a debate about whether the role of French language scholarship in studies of Canadian history. I think in certain areas that role is greater than in others. But something like 30% of all titles published in Canadian history are written in French, right? So, and that's not necessarily reflected in the different subfields.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in First Nations history and the history of settlers, settler Indigenous relations or state Indigenous relations, French is even less present than in kind of mainstream Canadian history. I think there's a whole set of reasons for this. I think part of that is kind of a generational thing. A lot of people who came of age in the 90s in particular, with the referendum, can be, maybe have a certain kind of instinctual or an allergy almost to Quebec. There's a that raises hackles, and so that's just sort of left alone in some cases. But
as a Quebecer that's been living in Ontario for many, many, many years, I can tell you that sometimes my person, can cause some derision from my fellow citizens. So
yeah, of course, it can be. It depends. It can be a very touchy subject, but I think the other thing is that for whatever reason, in scholarship on First Nations in particular and settler First Nations relations, from about the 1990s, like the largest part of really great scholarship in this field started coming out of British Columbia. And so BC is distant from Quebec. It's scholarship. The questions are often distant from those of scholars of Quebec or French Canada, and so that started to take, I would say, a big part of the historiography, and it still remains an extremely important piece of this particular field. And so I think scholars were looking to those sorts of studies, and they weren't looking to Quebec. There are other sort of structural issues too. I mean, so there have been a number of very important, to my mind, works that have come out of French language universities and scholars in Quebec on these questions. But some of the structural issues are around where these are happening. So, for example, I'm at U of T. We basically no longer have master's theses. Like it's theoretically possible to write a master's thesis at the University of Toronto in history, but we really discourage students from doing it. In Francophone universities in Quebec, people still write master's theses, and very substantial master's theses, 200-page master's theses, often on subjects that have not been studied. So this is totally novel research. And so a number of master's theses and PhD theses since the 90s really have dealt with issues of, the fur trade, Indian agents, for example, the band councils, conservation policies and fisheries. All of these things have been written about in excellent MA theses that, if you're not part of the system, you probably don't know much about. And, to be fair, there's a fairly serious divide between French and English Canada and some of these subjects. And so even like the institutions, people working in English language universities might not realize that there is a University of Quebec, Abitibi-Témiscamingue, or Trois-Rivières. And so they wouldn't even know where to look in some sense for these things. So I think that's part of it. And there's, I would encourage people to try to do this, but I mean, the field too is one in which I think also, the major kind of intellectual influences too are not coming out of Quebec either. So the sort of theoretical contributions, though, they were extremely important to my work. Like I would not have written this book in the way I did if I had not taken classes with and learned from people like Jean-Marie Facteau, who is, an absolute heavyweight in Quebec scholarship, is known outside of Quebec, but not very much, because he published quite a bit in French. Only, I think, one piece in English ever, and he even published in with Colonial Leviathan. His chapter is in French, which is the sort of fascinating. I'm not really sure what he was up to there, but it's a very. I think he's making a statement.
Yeah.
So there are these scholars who do really important work, and are continuing to do really important work. And I think one of the things that when you look at Quebec in the particular field of First Nations history or the history of colonialism, is you see different developments happening. So you see, for example, the development of the Indian Act quite differently when you dig into the relations between First Nations in Quebec and legislators. So, ideas, requests effectively coming from men, chiefs, and I talk about this a bit in the book, to introduce effectively gendered discrimination in law. So, that very much resemble the Indian Act before, from the 1830s and 1840s. There's the development of reserves looks very different if you're looking at it from Quebec as well. And there's a whole set of issues like that. And really fascinating possibilities too. So one of the things I always tell my colleagues who are working in the rest of Canada is we have notarial archives in Quebec. If you want to study the material conditions of life in an Indigenous community, I can hardly imagine a better, richer source than notarial archives, which are difficult to deal with, of course, and they're a slog, and they're all mostly in French. But this is the sort of source that simply does not exist in the rest of the country, and so the scholarship outside of Quebec, can't work with those and doesn't look to those as a source for doing this sort of research. So I think there's only things to be gained from doing this kind of.
Yeah, I mean, those notarial archives. I spent my summer of 2000, spring summer 2004, working for Beatrice Craig at the University of Ottawa, going through a whole bunch of notarial archives at the Archives Nationales de Montréal, and I mean, it is mind numbing, like at the end of the day, my eyes would be so like, this is just so tiring, but I mean, it's a treasure trove of information. It is absolutely, it's wonderful. And that's one of the things that, I like when I work on, like Quebec, is they are very, very meticulous record keepers, right? So it's not just like at the parish level, but, like notaries do keep a lot of records, and you could learn a lot from a region by just looking at that documentation. And
yeah, absolutely. And in the context, again, I mean, just to belabor the point, but we see, for example, scholarship is starting to question these things, but for a long time we imagined the Indian Act as sort of imposed from on high by kind of evil politicians and bureaucrats and whatever the capital happened to be when they were writing the piece of legislation involved. And like when you look in the notarial archives, you see that this is a lot more complicated. And in this case, like, for example, not necessarily the genesis of the act, but whether it's being respected or not. And frankly, quite often, if you read the Indian Act, you think everything that's happening in the archives are impossible. Or many of the things, because they're doing all these things that are explicitly outlawed by the Indian Act. And we don't have good information on this elsewhere, but in Quebec we do. And so we could do this sort of scholarship of really kind of, complicating what this means. Like, what is the Indian Department actually doing? What can it do? And what is the agency, as much as that word is, problematic for all sorts of reasons of Indigenous peoples in this colonial system.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the benefits of, going to Quebec to do archives is you will have to spend some time in Montreal, which is, like the greatest city on the planet. So, So it's a, like it's a win-win. Um, One of the things that we like to talk about, like with scholars, are really just trials and tribulations of around our work in research, right? Like it shows that no matter how successful we are as academics, this is still a really difficult job, and not everything comes as easy. And I think that sometimes as academics could do a better job of normalizing these difficulties, right? Because we don't talk about that, and then when you hit a wall, you kind of like feel, oh man, am I the only one that hits a wall? And then you start getting down on yourself. So and like in an attempt to normalize these difficulties. So what were some of the challenges that you had when working on your specific topic?
Yeah, that's a hard question to answer because I could go on for hours, right? Um, I mean,
What keeps you up? What kept you up at night?
everything. I mean, like I mean, first of all, I would say just quite bluntly, I mean, this book was published in the summer of 2020,
Mm.
and I started the dissertation that became the book in the fall of 2004.
Mm.
So, that's a long time, right? It's not the longest. Some people take longer. Some
Good
people
history takes time. That's what I keep. That's the one thing that I remember the most from my time as a PhD is that people used to tell me all the time, good history takes time, but somehow we forgot about that. So it's like now you have to pump out a whole bunch of articles to compete for SHIRT, to compete for these job applications and everything. But
Yeah,
good history takes a really, really long time, and
yeah,
it
absolutely.
shows, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it takes time, and so one of the things it takes too is a lot of quote unquote wastes, right?
Mm.
So if I were to put everything that I wrote as part of this project, sort of stack it end to end, I would have 12, maybe not 12, 5 volumes as long as this, because part of the process, right, is actually figuring out what you don't know but don't actually need to have in the book. You need to know in order to write the book, but doesn't need to be in the book. And that's, I think, the biggest difficulty I had during the PhD, certainly, but continuing in after the dissertation and into the manuscript edits, was that, and edits is a kind word, rewrite I think is a much more appropriate term, is that so much ends up on the cutting room floor,
Mhm.
and accepting that, and in fact celebrating that, because those pieces were essential. Like without them, I couldn't have written this. And I think that in some fields it's different, but like in big chunks of Canadian history, like there are just people who have not done this work before. Like there is kind of it's not a desert, but
Mm.
this isn't the history of the U.S., right? We don't have thousands of scholars pumping out monographs on any given century or decade or event in some cases.
Mhm.
And so the sorts of things you need to know, often you can't just go, and this was my experience, I couldn't just go to a book and pick it up and read it and then understand everything. I had to try to combine books with primary source research and all of this stuff. So I would say the kind of the one of the difficulties was just the heterogeneity of all of the material. And so I was writing about, I tried to do kind of a top-down and bottom-up analysis in the book. And so the bottom-up analysis is based in a few the particular experiences of a few communities. So Moose Factory in Ontario, and Wendake and Mashtayash in Quebec. Um, and the three communities like have archival coverage that is radically different.
Mhm.
So some sorts of sources are available for some and not for others. And so trying to compare these things that are already apples and oranges and watermelons are, when you add in the vastly different source material available for each, is makes it tricky. And then of course, in trying to sort of dig out a niche, the looking at money in colonialism in Quebec and Ontario in the 19th and 20th centuries, all of those things require, activating different scholarships and
Mhm.
dealing with different questions. And then I would say just sort of like really personal stuff too. Like, I grew up in the States. I moved to Montreal to do my PhD, and I had been living in Europe, and so moving to Montreal was sort of reassuring. Like some of the weird things in Europe disappeared, but then other strange things popped up that made me think. Like at first blush, I was like, "Oh, I'm back in North America. This is easy. I understand it." But of course, I didn't. And it took a while to sort of just to navigate that, to say like, okay, now I understand the codes
Mhm.
of living in this place that are different. And now, of course, I don't want to get get the trolls angry with us, but Montreal is a damn fine place. And like I now when I go back, it's like I'm going home, right?
Yeah.
And so, but that takes time. All of that takes time, and figuring out who it is you need or want to work with too, right? The kind of the networking sounds like sinister, sort of,
Mhm.
but it's also like a basic human necessity. And so figuring out what your networks are and who the people are who and not only can help you, but who you can build up a solid relationship with. All of these things took time, and then having family, work life sort of balance, which is never easy either. So I mean, a lot of these things are the kinds of things that everyone has to deal with, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
Um,
especially when you're at the end of your PhD and you have like a partner that's pregnant, and like you can
yeah,
see like, after like, like in 9 months, I will have no time to work on this dissertation anymore. So I got to get it done as quickly as possible. But one of
exactly.
the things,
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, sorry, like one of the things about the book too, and just like the sort of progress of this particular book was that I stopped too. Like after finishing my PhD, I didn't have a job. I was doing sessional work. I was doing contract research,
yeah.
and so I set it down. And picking it back up was hard.
Mhm.
I mean, I was motivated to, because the sort of prize at the end now is a job for life, and
Mhm.
so that's a good motivating factor, right? But I think that that was a challenge, but it was also a blessing. I think
Mhm.
like you need to, in my experience, we maybe should expect a little bit less of ourselves. So
Yeah.
coming to that realization of how to actually expect less was important too, but tricky.
Learning to take breaks and going on vacation and not feeling guilty about it, all these things that, like take forever. But with all the recent discussions about the prevalence of systemic racism in Canada and how it affected, but, continues to affect, like African Canadians, Indigenous peoples, and racialized communities across Canada, your book is really, really relevant. So, you know, what does your book teach us about systemic racism in Canada? And really, what lessons do you hope readers will gain from your book about the current discussions that are happening around systemic racism?
Yeah, okay. I mean, my instinct is to be modest here and to say it's an academic book, right? It's a research monograph, and it really is. Like, so I don't want to like make a false advertisement that this is a book that's aimed at sort of a broad public. It's aimed at academics, graduate students, upper level undergrad. So it's that sort of headspace you need to be in. Uh, but I think it clearly has something to say about systemic racism.
Mm,
I mean, I think um, one of the things that comes back to, and I already mentioned it, this is this trope of Indigenous peoples as inherently improvident. So, and this gets constructed, sort of, I would say even consciously constructed in debates in the 1820s and 1830s, when the Colonial Office and the Treasury in Britain want to shift Indian presence. So these presents that are born of early modern diplomacy,
mm,
uh, they want to transform them into monetary payments, because they would save money on freight effectively. Like
mm,
it's cheaper to ship money than it is to ship bulky trade goods, and they could give the same amount of market value to First Nations in currency that they could in goods while saving money, right? But the answer on the part of colonial officials here is no, 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 no. Because what's going to happen, and this is an extremely gendered and racialized answer. The answer is, well, what's going to happen is indigenous men will take the money and get drunk. And then the indigenous women and children and the men won't have access to the basic necessities like blankets and ammunition and other material items that we were giving them before. So we're going to have to pay twice if we do this. And this, by the late 1830s, becomes consensus and goes all the way through the whole book. And in fact, I open the conclusion with a quote, a little episode involving François Bernardel, who is, at the time, this is 2011, he was a member of the National Assembly in Quebec from Action Démocratique du Québec, which of course morphed into the CAQ. Bernardel is now the Minister of Transport in Quebec. So a major player in provincial politics, and he effectively, I mean, if we account for idiom, he says exactly the same thing that 19th century commentators say when it's revealed that Hydro-Quebec has made these monetary payments to the Innu on the North Shore. He basically says, well, what's going to happen is they're all going to get drunk and we're going to have to go and bail them out. And this remains, I think, a constant throughout the book and throughout up to the present, where decisions are being made based on this extremely liberal individualist notion of responsibility that's extremely racialized and gendered. Indigenous women and children need protecting. Indigenous men are threatening. I mean, it is racism 101 is part of this, and it is baked into the system. And so I hope that this one example, and we could multiply this example by looking at other issues as well. I hope that this one example at least serves as clear and concrete demonstration that this systemic racism is actually a thing and has been for a very long time. And so that's my sort of modest contribution there. I hope that this helps because it seems so blindingly obvious.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what's next for you? What other projects are you working on? Are you, I hate to bring this up, because you just finished publishing one book, but what's your second book?
It never stops. So no, my second book is really is carrying on this project in a certain sense. So this project is really, so the book that was just published is really a political history of money as practice, but it's less a history of public finance or fiscal relations. So one of the questions I often get, especially when I'm speaking with indigenous communities, is like, and the Indian Fund. So what's up with that? And I talk a little bit about it in the book, but it's sort of marginal to what the broader project. And so my next project is really trying to do, is going to be a history of Crown First Nations fiscal relations. Mm-hmm. And this takes up, kind of this, the broadly used conceptual framework of settler colonialism, which is focused on land, right? And one of the things that strikes me as particularly necessary is to look at how that land gets transformed into capital and what that capital then does. Mm-hmm. And so, what happens is, a very small portion of that land is sold off and feeds into, or, a small portion of the value of the land into what is called the Indian Fund. And this takes a while to get going, but by the mid-19th century, it's kind of off its feet and running, and continues to exist and goes through a number of changes over the period. But that money has supported all sorts of institutions in Canada, across Canadian society, that we don't often think about. So, places like McGill University received a very substantial loan from the Indian Fund in 1860. The city of Toronto, many of its debentures, so basically its securities that it sold to raise capital for city works like paving streets in the 19th century, were invested in through the Indian Fund. The Law Society of Upper Canada, the port, the harbor in Port Credit, what is now Mississauga as well. So there are all these places, the Montreal Turnpike Company, I mean, I could go on, that have fiscal origins or financial origins in funds that were raised by the sale of Indigenous lands that were then invested to create interest for those funds, right? So I'm interested in all of that, how this happened. I'm also interested in the sort of ways in which the state constrained access to those funds for First Nations as well over the whole period. So this is really looking at, this is even a longer book, from the turn of the 19th century through the 20th century. So about 200 years I'm planning to look at. And this changes quite a bit. So it changes, for example, when you get into, there's a very tight control on it. And then you get into the sort of post-war period and control remains tight, but the discourse shifts. So we stop talking about assimilating Indigenous peoples and we start talking about development, right? But as other scholars have argued, development is effectively assimilation under a different name. And when you look at the Indian Fund and the sorts of things that it's investing in, it's really fascinating. I mean, we're still talking about, the kind of legitimate, the target sorts of expenditures in the 1960s as being the clearing of land. In the 1960s, if you have not cleared your land, it's because you shouldn't be farming on it in Canada. There's a pretty clear, divide there. And yet the reason or the functioning of the fund is that. And then I have another I have a couple of other minor projects, but the other one is dealing with the notarial archives, actually, to look at market activity among First Nations in cities in southern Quebec, primarily Montreal and Quebec City in the 19th century. Because the way we think about urban history often is sort of exclusive of indigeneity in Canada until the 1960s, maybe. But in fact, of course, First Nations are just as present in Montreal throughout its history as they have been more recently. So I think I want to try to dig into these notarial archives as a way of getting into that sort of history that's maybe been set aside a bit.
Awesome. Well, we have a lot to look forward to in the future. So again, thanks for coming today to talk to us about your book. Hopefully, once this whole pandemic is over, we'll be able to actually meet in person, maybe have a drink on a terrace. Like I will never, ever, ever take, like drinks on a terrace, like for granted ever again.
No. I know, like I would love to be able to have, some crappy hors d'oeuvre and have a book launch, like an actual, like in-person thing and see people that I'd like to see.
I know, I miss our, like really, really like, like dried, catered sandwiches at the university.
The horrible coffee and everything else. Yeah.
I know, I want it all. So thanks again for coming, and we'll see you around.
My pleasure. Thanks for
Later. Bye.
Bye.